Welcome to the complete free-to-play team building guide to beating Honkai Star Rail. The goal here will be to create teams and strategies in order to clear any content in the game using only the free characters we're given, either through the story or events, as well as potential 4 and 5-star upgrades while you're progressing through and pulling on banners. While the focus will mainly be for new or returning players, all the info here will be helpful for free-to-play and low spenders looking to clear endgame content like Memory of Chaos, Pure Fiction, and even the harder simulated universe game modes. With that being said, let's get right into it, and feel free to skip to any of the sections listed here on screen. The first thing you need to know before even thinking about who to build or invest in is what makes a good team. The neat thing is, there's a lot of flexibility when creating teams, but there's a general formula you'll want to follow, and it'll vary depending on what stage of the game you're in. When you're first starting, and honestly for the vast majority of the game, survival is the #1 priority. Dealing damage is important, and of course, since the faster you do damage, the less of it you'll take. But early on, we want to prioritize comfort so we don't end up running into a wall during the story or against certain bosses. So if possible, 2 of our 4 character slots will be dedicated to sustain, which can be fulfilled by preservation or abundance characters. The 3rd slot will be occupied by your primary damage healer, and he'll be the most important character to heavily invest in, as your team's overall strength will scale the highest with their growth. The 4th and final slot can be any character that amplifies the damage of your main DPS, either a Harmony character to provide them with buffs, or a Nihility character that can apply debuffs to your enemies. Once you've reached a level of survivability where you're never in any danger or you have a stronger sustain character, you can actually opt to switch to a solo sustain setup. Instead of the 2nd sustain character, you can drop them for another amplifier or a 2nd damage healer. You're going to be sacrificing a bit of survivability for damage, but you'll find this quite often as the preferred team template in the endgame. There are a couple more considerations to make when building a team, being skill point management and elemental typing, but we'll get more into that once we've gone over the characters we have access to and what roles they'd fulfill. For our sustain slots, we have March 7th, Natasha, and eventually Fire Trailblazer and Lynx. These are fairly interchangeable, but I recommend you pick one from each path to get a good balance between damage mitigation and healing. For example, a combination of Fire Trailblazer and Natasha or Lynx, or March 7th with Natasha or Lynx. Of course, if you manage to get any of the 5-star sustain characters, you can use them in place of any of the aforementioned characters or as a solo sustain, especially if they're a limited 5-star. As for damage healers, we are given the Physical Trailblazer, Dan Hung, Serval, Herda, Qingque, and the MVP, Dr. Ratio. That's a lot of DPS options, and the most important factor in deciding who you bring to a fight will depend on whether the enemy is weak to their element or not. Matching the right elements will not only let you do more damage since their elemental resistances will be lower, but you'll also be able to inflict damage to their toughness bar. Since your DPS characters will be the ones attacking your enemies the most, they'll generally have the highest toughness damage output on your team. When a character depletes an enemy's toughness bar completely, they'll apply a weakness break with an effect that corresponds to their element, and this not only prevents them from moving momentarily, but also increases the damage they take while not having a toughness bar. Weakness breaking is one of the core mechanics of the game, and you can see why it's so important since you're not only increasing the amount of damage you deal, but also increasing your survivability. However, there are counter-arguments for choosing a DPS based on their element, and you'll find this most common when you're progressing through the earlier stages of the game. We only get a finite amount of resources each day, and we don't want to spread ourselves too thin by building too many characters. If the goal is to clear content efficiently, it's worth considering only investing in 1 or 2 damage healers at the start. If they're sufficiently strong, they'll be able to brute force content regardless of enemy weaknesses, and this is a viable option even in the late game. But of course, once you do have access to more resources, you'll want to run a damage healer that corresponds to the enemy's weakness. We'll go over some of the sample teams for each element after we cover our final slot, the Amplifiers. Our 2 free options are Asta and Yukong, and until the end of version 2.0, we'll have access to Gwenhyphen as a free 4-star choice, so I'll be including her in the discussion as well. Who you choose as your amplifier will mostly depend on how they enable your main damage healer, and we'll get into that right now with our sample team compositions. We might as well start strong with Dr. Ratio. He's going to provide imaginary damage coverage for us and also dominate fights with lots of elites or bosses. The most important consideration when building a team around him is ensuring we're able to consistently apply 3 debuffs on enemies, This will enable his talent's follow-up attack to occur 100% of the time, which is where a vast majority of his damage will come from. For our amplifier slot, Gwenifin will actually be the best choice thanks to both her burn status effect and Fire Kiss adding to the debuff count, which she can easily maintain on all enemies. What's more is her Fire Kiss allows her to stack vulnerability on enemies, a rare source of damage amplification that multiplicatively increases the damage they take. She's a great unit to pair with Dr. Ratio and can even contribute a moderate amount of damage. You can get away with running Asta here instead, as her Ascension Fortress has a chance for her basic attack to apply a burn to an enemy target, but it's a bit inconsistent due to its low base chance. She's really just here for her attack and speed buffs. As for the sustain options, both Fire Trailblazer and March 7th can apply debuffs, one with their taunt and one with their freeze, though you definitely don't want to rely on them and their main job will still be to help mitigate damage. I'd recommend Fire MC personally, as they can perform that task even by just using their basic attack to generate skill points. For the healer, either Lynx or Natasha will work, and it mostly comes down to availability. They both have an emergency team-wide heal on their ults and access to cleansing, which will be important for removing debuffs from your allies. Lynx is the better pick though in general, so use her if you can. Now, if we can stay alive with only one sustained character, we'd want to go with one healer, and this will allow one of our slots to be opened up for another amplifier or DPS. The best option in this case would be Asta, but Yukong is pretty effective as well. If you are planning on using Yukong, you need to make sure Dr. Ratio is the next ally to act right after she does, so he can benefit from her roaring bowstrings. This will not only increase his attack, but also his crit rate and damage when you use her ult. The reason you want Dr. Ratio to go after Yukong is, although roaring bowstrings lasts for the next 2 allies' actions, he wants his allies to hit enemies marked by his ult so he can launch his follow-up attacks. If roaring bowstrings isn't active during that time, he won't be buffed while his follow-up attacks are going off. Even still, it's a bit difficult to make full use of Yukong's buffs unless you have other characters with damaging ults, which allow them to proc Dr. Ratio's follow-up attacks outside of their turns. But she's still good, and thanks to her Ascension Fortress, you also get a nice little 12% imaginary damage bonus just by having her on the team. For those of you that were fortunate enough to have gotten a Pella or Silverwolf, either of the two will be the best in slot upgrade in place of Gwenifin. For the second amplifier role, Hanya will be more of a side grade to Asta, but still a decent option, with Tingyun being the top 4-star option overall, and roughly on par with Ranmei, though of course one is a limited 5-star character. The neat thing about Ranmei is her ultimate does add 1 to the count of debuffs when it's active. Bronya can work in this slot, but she'll make skill point management a bit difficult, as well as not being able to maintain her skill's damage buff on all of Dr. Ratio's follow-up attacks. On the other hand, while Sparkle can maintain all her buffs on Ratio while he's using his follow-up attacks, there isn't any crazy synergy between the two, and you're better off with running Tingyun or Ranmei. Okay, it's time for us to move on. Serval can provide lightning damage coverage for us, and she'll do well in multi-target scenarios thanks to her AoE attacks and shock dots. Thankfully, she's a lot more straightforward to run than Dr. Ratio, and we'll be using the same dual sustain setup to start. Asta is going to be your best amplifier if she's available, since her attack percent buffs affect all parts of Serval's kit. If we can afford to drop one of the sustain characters, we can add Yukong to greatly improve Serval's damage output. Tingyun is the best 4-star upgrade over Asta, and overall the best pick for the primary amplifier. You have a variety of options to choose from for your second slot over Yukong, with Pella and Hanya both being great choices. Again, it's no surprise that Ranmei is the best here, but basically it's a choose 2 for the amplifiers: Ranmei, Tingyun, Pella, Asta, Hanya, and Yukong in that order. Now, I wanted to quickly call out that some of Serval's best teams will run a Kafka or Black Swan, but since those are less of Serval teams where she's the primary focus and the aforementioned characters are limited 5-stars, I'm not going to cover them in too much detail. Ideally, you'd have your 1 sustain, Serval, Kafka, or Black Swan, and the final slot can go to a team-wide damage amplifier. This can be Pella or Asta as solid options, or Ranmei as the top. Again, while they might be the best teams with Serval in them, they aren't the best teams for Kafka or Black Swan. Nonetheless, if you like Serval and want to run her, these are possible upgrades to consider. Next up is Windan Hung, and he can definitely hold his own, especially in single target scenarios. He's got decent utility as well in the form of his speed reduction from his skill, and you want to build a team that can enable him to cast his ult when his talent is online. The situation with the sustains is the same old, but keep in mind that you can actually activate Dan Hung's talent by using a skill with March or with either Natasha's skill or ults. It's the same with Lynx, but we're not going to go over every example because that would take forever. The best free amplifier will easily be Asta, as her ult does trigger his talent while further increasing the team's speed, and overall just synergizes really well with Dan Heng's own speed reduction. In a solo sustain environment, you can throw in Yukong, but keep in mind that she can't actually trigger his talent with any of her abilities. As for upgrades, Tingyun strikes once again as the top option in place of Asta, with Hanya still being decent. This time around though, all of the 5 stars do take the top spots on this team, so if you do have them, pick one of Bronya or Sparkle, and then in order of strength, the second can be Ranmei, Tingyun, Pella, Hanya, and Yukong. The great thing with this setup is you can run the same supports with Qingque instead of Dan Heng, and now we have our Quantum team. This is the most universal support setup for most teams, and again, the DPS is fairly interchangeable. Whenever you pull a limited DPS character, chances are they'd fit in this team. Their preferred harmony and agility characters might change a little bit, but from here on, you can use this as the base template for any team building and just throw any new DPS onto it. On that note, since I haven't mentioned them yet, and as our last 2 free characters, as much as I like them, I just can't justify recommending Physical Trailblazer and Herta since we're looking for the best free-to-play teams. If you want to play them because you like the characters, by all means go ahead. It's definitely doable, but it'll take a little more effort than usual. However, this does change a bit for Pure Fiction, where Herta becomes an absolute monster and is undoubtedly one of, if not the best for that game mode in particular. But in short, we have 4 solid teams for general use, covering 4 of the elements using only free characters: Dr. Ratio for Imaginary, Serval for Lightning, Dan Heng for Wind, and Qingque for Quantum. When you're clearing content like Memory of Chaos, you'll need to pick 2 teams, one for each side. There's no concrete answer to which teams are going to be the best, it's completely situational, but the 2 things I want you to consider are weakness matching and avoiding support overlap. For example, Dr. Ratio can go on one side because he favors less contested supports like Gwennaifin, which leaves more options for your other half. If you find yourself struggling to clear caverns or echoes of war in the overworld, don't be afraid to use the support character feature. You can easily find highly invested units to carry you, and don't be ashamed, you're just trying to be efficient. You can also use food buffs to your advantage for these types of fights, and same thing goes for Simulated Universe. In the normal version, you can use food buffs, but not in Swarm Disaster or Golden Gears. If you're having trouble surviving, again, it's okay to go with double sustains. Blessings will do most of the work for you, so while character investment is still important, they do a lot less of the heavy lifting. As a final note for Pure Fiction, if you're looking to clear it, especially when you're restricted by unit choice, you need to use Herta on at least one of your teams and she'll be able to carry. On your second team, Serval will be able to handle multi-wave AoE combat the best, so stick with the team I recommended for her. Once you do get more characters, you now know where to slot them in to upgrade your teams, but I'm hoping this will be a good baseline for newer players to help set them up for success. There's so much more that I could cover, but I didn't want to stray away from the main goal, which was making the most out of what we are given. You will have stronger teams than this, so best of luck to those of you looking to take on the endgame. Honestly, with the free Dr. Ratio, right now is probably the best time to join the game, and after doing all this, I kind of feel motivated to start a brand new F2P account, but we'll see where that goes. If you have any questions about team building or the game in general, I'll be looking out in the comments to help, so leave them there. And with that, thank you for watching.